Okay, welcome to Web Wednesdays here at H&H Color Lab. My name is Bentley. Today's class is on getting good color, a few tips. Before we dive into this, there's some things that we probably should clear up before we start this class, what the expectations are, what I'm going to cover in this, and hopefully what you're going to be able to go away from or take away from today's class. One of the things that historically I have said here at H&H when I've taught classes, when I've worked with customers, I've said there's three things that if you do these three things, you're going to get great color 100% of the time. And the three things are A, exposure. Nail your exposure in the camera. B, get a good white balance in the camera, whether it's to do a custom white balance or know how to use your preset white balance. And three was to work with the correct ICC profile. Those are still true, as true today as they were probably 6 years ago, 7 years ago when I first said that, with one change. Today, our production systems are color managed, which means you don't have to be exactly in the sRGB profile. You could work in Adobe 1998, and our software will manage that profile correctly to get you the correct output or the right output. I still recommend that everybody work in the sRGB space because it most fits or comes closest to fitting our output spaces, our printers, the papers, all of those things. But if you want to work in Adobe 1998, there's nothing wrong with that. We can manage that appropriately. So really, I could end the class at this moment and say, getting good color, a few tips. Well, the two tips that you need to do are nail your exposure in the camera and use the correct white balance for the scene that you're shooting in. And that's true whether you're shooting RAW or JPEG. And that's one thing I'm going to work on in this class and try to let you know is this isn't geared to a JPEG shooter or to a RAW shooter. This is geared towards a photographer. It doesn't matter how you capture the image. These types of rules apply. Some of the tools that you use will be a little different if you're shooting RAW or JPEG, but the same basic principles are there. The next thing that we need to talk about is your perception of color. We have two things here that we have to, that are outside of H&H's control or my control. It's A, how well do you see color? What is your color perception? What is your color perception capabilities? Do you have deficiencies in seeing color? And those are things you may or may not be able to change. If you're colorblind or have some type of color blindness, no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to see the full range of color that we output. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way it is. The second part of this equation is how are you evaluating the color? What type of monitor are you using? Are you calibrating that monitor? How well is that calibrated? So those are some of the things that you need to be aware of. And when you're doing color, if we don't know for sure how well you see color and we don't know how good your monitor is, what do we do to get there? If we don't, the things that are out of our control, like I said, are how well you see color and quality of monitor that you have and can it show you accurate colors. If we don't have answers to either of those questions, what's our next step? If I'm a customer that has a color deficiency, and I have worked with a number of customers that are colorblind or know that they have serious color deficiencies, and one of the things that we've asked them is, how do you deal with these things? How do you get the color out of your files where you're happy? And they said, I just do what Bentley told me. I do a custom white balance, get it as close to perfect in the camera as I can, and I know that I have a good exposure and go from there. So if the techniques that I'm going to go through today aren't dependent upon my color perception or the quality of monitor that I'm on, these are techniques that I use if I'm out in the field and I'm looking at images on my laptop screen, which is not an ideal situation. If I'm looking at images in another location and I don't know the quality of the monitor, I will use these techniques as well. Okay, one of the first things that I'm going to show you is come in, and I'm going to bring up this first image into Photoshop and look at this. This is our color calibration image that is available from the H&H website. This is one of the tools that you're going to use to evaluate your images. One of the things that people get confused with is when they look at this, they say, well, my subject's skin tone doesn't match any of these people. And that's true. Everybody has a slightly different skin tone, but everybody has similar characteristics in their skin tone. We've got 3 very different skin tones on this image, and let me just do one quick thing here. So when we look at this image, we'll notice that every person on these images has a specular highlight, and that really wasn't a good color to draw with, so let me switch that to something a little bit more appropriate. But we see this specular highlight area up in the foreheads on them. We see that everybody has a shadow area, and what we're looking for is a clean shadow, a clean highlight. When somebody says, when I look at an image, I see these colors in them, one of the things that I'll often do is zoom up close on the image and look at the tones in the shadow transition areas, look to see, do I see any color crossover or any strange colors in the highlights, no matter what type of skin tone they are. That's what I'm looking for to see in that image. Okay? So I'm just going to take this image and close it for the moment. And we're going to go into one of the very first techniques that I learned to color correct an image when I didn't have good color. And this really, when I learned this technique and I realized what it did and how it applied to our printers at H&H, it really changed how I could start evaluating images for customers and how I could show them what was wrong with their images. This is based on a technique that I learned from a gentleman named Eddie Tapp. And if you've been around in digital for any length of time, you've probably heard his name. And his website is eddietapp.com, EDDIETAPP.com. And on his website, he has a section called e-learning or e-tutorials. And under that, you're going to find one that's called the 90% method. And it's his way of color correcting images using what he calls his 90% rule. And it's called the 90% rule because it works 90% of the time. This, as you can see, this article was written or modified back in 2005, and I learned about it probably in about 2001 or 2002 is when I really started working with it. And it is as true then as it is today. So let's go through and look at how we can use this Eddie Tapp's 90% rule to color correct an image without having to be biased by how we see color or what our monitor is. I'm going to leave this up for just another second and just reference that his PDF has all of everything I'm going to talk about in it is written in his PDF. He's got several different pages. He gets into a lot of technical detail. If you're going through and reading this and you get a little confused, and when you review this video you're still not sure, give me a call, drop me an email, and I'd be happy to go through that again with you. So let me move that out of the way and look at using his 90% method on this image here. This is a very old image that I captured. I was looking at the metadata on this, and I actually captured this image back in 2001 with a Fuji S1 Pro. For those of you that are fairly new to photography, that was really one of the cameras that was at the beginning of the digital revolution and really changed how we as a lab did business because it made digital affordable. Before that camera came out, we were looking at cameras in the $8 to $10 to $20,000 range or higher, and the Fuji S1 came out in a $4,000 price point. It was like, oh wow, this is affordable now. We look back on that, and in today's prices, that was a very expensive camera, but it was really the start. that camera was a camera that at the time only shot in JPEG. So everything you captured was JPEG, and you didn't have a way to shoot RAW. And it really taught you if you didn't shoot right, you weren't going to get a great image out of it. Some of the things that we want to show on this image, and I'm going to open up my channels view on my histogram palette, and we're looking at an image that, let me just do one more thing. I'm going to change my screen around, and I'm going to open up my reference image one more time. Let me jump over to that, just so we have a comparison for what skin tone can be. And I'll hide all those. So in looking at this, it's as a comparison, we can see that this skin tone is very yellow. We can also tell by just looking at the paper on it. One of the things that you have to be aware of is the longer that you look at an image, your eye will become desensitized, and you'll start thinking that that is good color. If we sit and look at this image for any length of time, we're going to start to say, hey, that looks pretty good, when it really is very, very yellow. So let's go through some techniques in correcting this image, and all of this is based on Eddie Tapp's 90% rule. What this rule basically says is when we look at an image, we want to identify the brightest area that has detail in it. So we're looking for the brightest white, and we're also looking for a pretty dark area that also has detail in it that will be a black. Those are the two areas that we want to set up. We want our white area to be no brighter than about 245 to 250, so we can save detail in it. And we want our black area to be brighter than at least 15 to 20, so that there's recognizable information in that to print. So I'm going to do this in CS4, and these techniques, the menus may be slightly different in CS3 and CS2, but the techniques are the same. The tools are the same. They may just be in a different place. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is on my eyedropper, I'm going to click and change my eyedropper from just the color sampler, or from the eyedropper tool to the color sampler tool. And we can see the color sampler tool is the one that has a little bullseye in the corner. So I'm going to select that. I can see that up here in my tool palette. What that lets me do is click on my image and start sampling points. So I've just sampled 4 points on my image, and we can see on my info palette down here, it has saved points 1, 2, 3, and 4, and given me RGB information about those 4 points. I'm going to go ahead and clear those points out, and I'm going to also change my point sample to a 5x5 average to average the color in a little bit better. For what I'm doing, that's going to be a little bit more accurate. So the first thing that I want to do is find the brightest point on this image. And to do that, I'm going to use my threshold adjustment and bring in a threshold adjustment layer. And what this does is wherever, for example, everything that's black right now on the image, I know is darker than a value of 137. As I slide this, I'm looking for the brightest area on the image, and I see I'm getting 2 right now. I'm getting one down in here in the paper, and I'm getting one up in this area. If I turn off that adjustment layer, I see the one up in this area is based on a specular highlight on that guest book. And so that's not going to be a good place to choose from. So I'm going to come back to this, and I'm going to get an area right down here in the paper here in the front. So I'm just going to zoom up on that, and I'm going to take my eyedropper and click in one of those white areas. So that's just given me an RGB value for that area. Now I'm going to zoom back out, and I need to get a black point as well. So I'm going to take my threshold slider and start sliding it to the left until I get just a little bit of black in the image. And you can see you can kind of get some detail. I would be cautious in using the guest black jacket. I'm going to come back here into the deep shadows, and I'm at a value here of 13. And so I'm just going to come in and click into this black area right here. Zoom back all the way out, and I've got my 2 color picker areas, so I'm going to turn off that threshold layer. I'm just going to double check this one and make sure spot number 2 is not in the flower area, which it's not. It's back in the deep shadows. Okay. So what I've done at this point is picked a shadow area, which right now the values are 12, 10, and 9. I'm looking down here on my info palette. And then a highlight value, which is 217, 161, and 90, and that's for this point number 1 on the white paper. My next step is to neutralize those 2 areas. So just so you see, I've got the threshold layer here, and I'm just going to throw that away. I don't need that anymore. That was just a tool I used to find my brightest area and my darkest area. I'm now going to bring in a levels adjustment layer. And for all intents and purposes, I can move all my tools right in front of the image because I don't need to see it for the next step. This is where I'm going to start looking at number value to adjust this. On my levels adjustment layer, I see I have an RGB mode, and then I have a red, green, and blue channel. Those are giving me the 3 channels that I want to work with. And what I want to do is end up making the numbers that I'm seeing on my info palette equal. And I'm going to close my histogram window for just a second because we don't need to see that. So I want to make this red, green, and blue value equal. And I want to make on my highlights and on my shadows. What you're seeing here is a before and after number. So right now everything is, the numbers on both sides of that are the same. I need to make my adjustments to 2 of the 3 channels, meaning my red channel, my green channel, and blue channel. I can only adjust 2 of them. If I try to adjust all 3, I'm going to end up chasing my tail and not getting something fixed. So which 2 should I adjust? Well, if you read the document that Eddie Tapp has, he says, when you're adjusting for your highlights, adjust for the highest value. So looking at my highlight value, my highest value here is 217 on my red channel. So I want to make my green channel and my blue channel equal to 217. How do I do that? Real simple. I'm going to jump over to my adjustment levels, change my level channel to green, and I'm going to adjust this right slider to make the green value change from 163 to 217. Okay? So I'm going to come in and slide this to the left till I adjust it to 217. I'm going to just tweak it back and forth, and now that I've got the green channel and the red channel equal. I'm going to do the same thing one more time by going to my blue channel, adjusting that rightmost slider on the levels adjustment, and bring it up to 217. And I've got it at 221. Just going to nudge that down a little bit. And I can do 216 or 218. Both are really, really close. And so if we pause for just a second and look at the before and after, we can tell there's been a big change made to that image. But we're not done yet. We still need to take care of our shadow area. If we look at our shadow area, we see that the numbers are still not equal, but they have changed. We have 12, 13, and 22. What we want to do here is adjust our values to the lowest number. And our lowest number is the green channel, which started at 10, which is now 13. So 12 and 13 are real close together. We mainly need to adjust our blue channel. So we're still on our blues. We're going to go to the left slider on the histogram or on the levels and slide it to the right. Oops, I'm sorry. There we go. I moved it too quick. And I just moved that just a little bit, and now I have 12, 13, 15. Real close. Let's see if we can move it one more. There we go. Everything's dialed in. It's neutral. 12, 13, 13, 217, 217, 215. So we're done adjusting that image. Again, here's the before and the after. And let's go and compare that back to the Shirley image we saw earlier. And I'll bring these two side by side. And when we look at that, we can see we have a skin tone that's a lot closer to our reference image. Even though his skin tone is not going to be perfectly the same, we're now in the right ballpark. So there's our before and our after in comparison. We are a lot better. By using those numbers, at no time did I evaluate my image based on my perception of it. Everything that I evaluated was based on numbered data, and that numbered data is going to be the same whether I'm on a Mac, a PC, I'm on a calibrated LaCie monitor, or I'm on the monitor I bought from Best Buy. It doesn't matter. The number value is going to be the same, so this is going to work. Is that slow? Certainly. If I have a range of images that I need to adjust at the same time, let me show you the next step. I'm going to go ahead and close this reference image and open up one more file. And let's just show these two side by side. So let me come over here one more time and turn this off. So when we look at both of these images side by side, I've just taken the corrections off of the first image. We can see these are very similar. The lighting conditions were similar. The exposure was similar. So what I want to do is just take the corrections from my first image and apply them to the second. And all I have to do is drag that correction layer and drop it on the second image, and that will apply it. So let's get that over there. Oops, and it's not working. Give me just a moment. I'm going to undock both of those. So there I have the two images side by side. I'm going to drag these corrections from the corrected image over to the uncorrected image right there. And so there's the before and after on that. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better. And so I could use that and drag that to a lot of images to make a correction fairly quickly. Is it the ideal situation? Like I said, no. Ideally, it would have been great to capture that with a custom white balance or used a tungsten preset white balance to get me a lot closer. But that's how I would correct that without being able to know, do I have a good screen or a good monitor? So I'm going to pause for just a second and let you guys, if anybody has any questions on that technique, to click on the chat bar down on your meeting controls and type me a question. And while you're doing that or thinking of questions, I'm going to get ready with our next images. So take a quick pause here. And you can also use the raise your hand icon down at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little icon that lets you raise your hand. You can do that to ask questions as well. Okay, we're now going to go to the next technique that I want to talk about, and that's using is a technique called face mask histograms. This is a technique that I got from another well-known photographer named Will Crockett out of Chicago. He has a website called shootsmarter.com, and let me take you to that website. And he has a technique, like I said, called face mask histograms. And this is a technique that you can use for proper exposure control. Again, this was originally updated back in November of 2006. It still works today, whether you're shooting RAW or JPEG, and it's a great way to go. Dave asks, will this work in RAW before we convert images to JPEG? As far as, Dave, are you asking about the 90% rule or face mask histograms on that question? 90% rule? I think your question on that was yes. When we get into RAW, the 90% rule is, well, let's jump back for just a second. And that's a good question that I didn't talk about, is we can work with RAW files or JPEG files in Adobe Camera Raw And let me bring this image up into Adobe Camera Raw. I messed with this yesterday just to see what I could get. One of the things that you're going to find, and I'm just going to quickly put two eyedroppers in about the right spots. In Camera Raw, you don't have individual red, green, blue sliders. You have a temperature and a tint slider. So as you're adjusting those, it becomes a lot more difficult to try to get those three numbers to balance in. There's not a way to just say, hey, I want to adjust these or those. So like right now, I've got the shadows equal, but the red, green, blue aren't. In Camera Raw, I could also come in and just take the eyedropper and start clicking around on the image and trying to find a neutral spot. And what I noticed in doing that yesterday, clicking on this image, I ended up with something that, while it was much better, still wasn't as good as using the 90% rule on it. If I'm shooting RAW, I really need to start by having either, I need to have a good reference image or something that I know is neutral to click on. I could also come in, because this is JPEG, I can't choose different preset white balances. If this was RAW, I would have a white balance that would say tungsten that should get me closer. Now, if this is an image that I really need to work on, and it's RAW, and I don't have a good balance or good image to click from to apply a white balance to it, I would probably change my color depth to 16-bit and then use that 90% rule on the image inside of Photoshop, because it's going to give me more room to work. Okay? Hope that answered your question. So the short answer, Dave, is it really doesn't work in Camera Raw. While Camera Raw gives you a lot of opportunity to adjust the image, it's not as close. And let's just, as a quick comparison, open that image into Photoshop and open up the original JPEG. Let me clear something. And put those two side by side. And I'm going to move some stuff out of the way. And if I do that same type of adjustment, I'm just going to bring my levels up. And I'm not going to do all the detail that I did before, but I'm just going to do a quick eyeball on it. I've used this image for years, so I know about where to put everything. And that's not perfect, but you can see here we're getting a lot closer by doing this through the 90% rule than trying to correct that as the RAW file. So as reference, the click balance on RAW is on the left. The 90% rule method is on the right, and that's the corrected. And hide some of this so you can see both of them. So that's where we started. That's where we ended up. It's much better. This still has a very magenta cast to it. Okay, moving on. Let's close these two images and go back to our face mask histogram. Okay, so Will Crockett goes through, and his website is shootsmarter.com. You do have to log in to get to his website. It's a no-charge website. All they do is capture your email. You do get about one email a week from him with new articles or new tips, so you're not going to get overloaded with spam. And there is an opt-out on that. But he goes through and gives you all the steps that I'm going to talk about on face mask histograms and shows you some images, some graphs, and explains how they look. And he also talks about what happens when you've got different skin tones. If you've got somebody that has a really dark complexion, that has a strong tan, how that's going to work as well. So be sure to check that article out, and we're going to actually go through some of that here in today's class. So let me go and open up another image. And on this example, I know this was a set of images that I shot and bracketed to specifically show this. So we're going to open up 3 different images that are a full f-stop apart. So the three I've selected, I've got one that's at f6.3. Oops, I'm sorry, at f5.6. I don't want the 6.3. I've got one at 5.6. I've got one at f8, and I've got one at f11. So that gives me three images that are a full f-stop apart. So let's just open those up into Photoshop. I'm going to tile my display here so we can see all three of them at the same time. And I'm just going to leave my histogram window open, and I'm going to move the rest of the tools off the screen because you don't need to see them for the moment. And I'm going to kind of balance that in between. As we look at these three images, we can see the overexposed image here on the very left, the underexposed image is in the middle, and the correct exposed image is on the right. And as we click on those, we can see that the histograms really change. It's really hard to evaluate the exposure looking at the overall histogram, especially in a scene like this where we've got a dark background and a white blouse. We've got a full histogram here. So what we're going to come in and do is do a face mask histogram. To do that, we're going to go to our marquee tool, and I'm going to make sure my marquee is set to the oval and the feather is set to 0. So very important on those. I need an oval marquee and a feather set to 0. And I'm going to start with this overexposed image, and I'm just going to marquee the mask of the face. So I'm looking to get up into the hairline, both sides of the face, and down underneath the chin. And I'm going to change my channel mode to luminosity so I just see the density here on my channel mode. And I'm going to do that same selection on the underexposed image, and on the normal exposed image. So what I'm looking for is a gap left and a gap right on all three of those. Now looking at this one, this image I've got quite a bit of gap here, so I'm going to say that's still a little bit under. So we can go back and get a different exposure if we need to. We can see on the really underexposed image that it's significantly slid to the left, and we've got a much greater gap going on there. And on the one on the right, we can see that it's pushed all the way up to the right side, and we have a gap over on the left. Once again, I can use this technique to say, is my exposure correct, no matter the condition of my monitor, whether my monitor is really dark or really light. I can look at this information and say, do I have a good exposure? This is probably the biggest technique that you can use to judge your exposures right out of your camera. Is my exposure good? Let's look at the face mask histogram and see. Let's jump back into Bridge, and let's go to image number 4, which is going to be one lighter. And I'm going to tile these so we can see all of them at the same time. So image 4 is this one down here. We'll put a marquee around her face there. And we're getting a more balanced left and right. Here's image 5. We can watch the histogram change as I go back and forth between those, heading towards a correct exposure. Okay? So by using the face mask histogram, I know that I have a good exposure just by looking at the shape of this histogram. Something that I need to mention here is if you've got somebody that's wearing earrings or has glasses with glass glare in there, you want to do hold down your Alt-Option key when you do the selection and just marquee out that area. So in this case, I took out the eyes, so I would take out any specular highlights because they could throw off that histogram. Okay? I'm just going to add those back in. So looking at this, once again, using the face mask histogram, I know I now have a good exposure based on the way the histogram looks. So if my exposure is good, and then I go in and do the 90% rule on a white balance, I now know my image should be very printable for H&H to get good color for me. I'm going to be in probably a good range if I'm doing studio to color correct. If you're doing studio color correct, then it becomes we need to get to the next level and make sure we're working with a good monitor. We're calibrating our monitor and following all those procedures that you really need to do. But this will get you close enough that we can color correct, studio to color correct, H&H to color correct, and get you great prints from it if you follow these rules. Okay? So, face mask histograms. Let's close these images, and we were looking at the raw image here. Let's go and look at the same images, we were looking at JPEGs. Let's look at those same images in RAW. I'm going to reset this real quick and come over to Adobe Bridge, and let's look at the RAW files. So I'm going to grab the exposure 7.1 because we thought that was the most correct. We're going to grab exposure F11, and we're going to go 5.6 and open those three up into Camera Raw. And I've got a problem with image number 8, so I'm going to cancel out of that, and we're not going to use that one. We're going to use one more, just a little bit darker. So here's my three images again. Now, one of the challenges in using Adobe Camera Raw or in Lightroom is you don't have an oval marquee tool. All we have is a crop tool. I'm just going to set the crop to normal, and I can get about the same results by just doing a square crop. It's difficult, but I can get close to it. And here I just look at my histogram up above, slide that down till I have a gap on the left and a gap on the right, and clear that crop out, and that's going to get me pretty close. Still blown out some areas in her blouse down below, but you know, it's an overexposed image. What do we expect? We can't make it perfect. Okay? Here is the image that is a more correct exposure, and we do that same crop on her face, and we see we're getting a very similar gap left, gap right. It's showing us a little bit more information here, and partly because we're doing a square crop on it. It's just difficult to do. So let's go to the next step on this. If we're doing Camera Raw, we can kind of come in and judge exposure using the color sampler method. And this works great for portraits. It's not something that you're going to use on a commercial job or on a landscape, but it does work all the time on portraits. And I'm going to give you some magic numbers here, and they are slightly different whether you're using Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw within Bridge or Photoshop. The magic number for Photoshop or for Adobe Camera Raw is between 235 and 240, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in just a minute. The magic number for using Adobe or for using Lightroom is about 92%, between 92 and 94%. How did I figure out that percentage? Basically, 235 divided by 255 is 92%. 240 divided by 255 is about 94%. And that's because Lightroom does everything as percentages. And that's a whole other discussion we're not going to get into. So what I'm looking for is the brightest area on my subject's face. And the easiest way to find that, I don't have a threshold, but if I turn on my warning colors, and I did that by just clicking on the triangle in the upper right corner of my screen, as I take my exposure up, I'm looking to find that first warning color that starts showing up on the skin. And I'm looking for an area that is specular but still retains detail, which in this case is going to be right here on her cheek. And I'm going to grab the color sampler tool once again and just click in the cheek to add a color point that gives me my RGB values. Now, let's zoom back out where we see the whole image, and my RGB value, this is where my magic number comes into play. I want that red value to be in the range of 235 to 240. Right now it's hitting 255 because we made it really bright. So if I back that down and get that highlight in that 235 to 240 range, so I'm at 238 there, and I see I've darkened this image down by about half of a stop. if I come in and marquee or mask off the face mask, I see my face mask histogram now is starting to match what we saw earlier when we were working on it as a JPEG. So I can use this number as well as face mask histograms to know, is my exposure good on this? The next thing that I can tell you here, and I'm not going to go much beyond this, is just to say that your red number on a good skin tone should always be the highest and the blue should be the lowest. There are people that will say, oh yeah, there's a certain percentage that these need to be apart. I think that's too much work if you're needing to go that way, but be aware that you can do that. You can also, going back to, let's make sure we have a good file in the camera to start with. So let's adjust these other two images, and I'm just going to quickly put an eyedropper point in there. Get it in the right spot. I'm not quite perfect. Oh, right there on the skin tone. Adjust that to get to between 235 and 240. And I'll put it there at 237. We'll crop again. We've got a good face mask histogram here up in the upper right. We'll clear that sample out, or that crop, and we'll go to the overexposed image, do the same thing. And adjust it. Now, as we look through those three images, they're not perfect. I didn't spend time working on adjusting the color in or adjusting the contrast in, but you can see we've got a much more similar skin tone. The underexposed image has gone very contrasty, so I could lighten that contrast up a little bit. There's our normal, and our underexposed image is a little flat, so we can bump up contrast. So we can see we've gotten pretty close just by using those numbers and using the face mask histogram on those. If we open those up in Photoshop and look at the actual face mask histograms, they're going to be very similar. So let's do that real quick. I'm going to make these open much faster. Let's tile those three, move all my tools out of the way, bring my histogram back, and marquee tool, and just go through each one. And you're seeing here with them side by side that we do have some color differences. But there's the face mask histogram on the image that was the most correct. See, we have a good gap right. We're touching on the left side just because the contrast is a little bit high. Here's our way overexposed image, again, left gap right, and the underexposed image. We have a little bit more gap right, no gap left because we were having to bring that up from so dark. But we're very similar going across all three. So the numbers that I gave you are backed up by using face mask histograms, and the face mask histograms are backed up by using the numbers. So those two things validate each other. So it's a great way, again, to check exposure and start going using that to evaluate your images. The next step is, once you have a good image like this, you can start using it as your calibration image to say, this is what I want to match everything to. Let's go and open up our reference image real quick. And bring all these side by side. And now we can see that all three of these are similar. They're not the same, they're not perfect, but they're similar as far as tones and all the details that we're looking at, matching all three of these together. We can see, I can tell this one was the overexposed image by the way the specular highlights look. They have a little bit of a metallic sheen. I know that an underexposed image is going to have a little bit higher black point, which is going to make it a little bit more contrasty. But we've got very good images compared to where we started. Okay? So let's close all these and look at another set of images. And I need to get to the right set here. Oh, here we go. I was in the wrong folder. Okay. In this case, we're going to talk about using zebra cards. This is one of the tools that we provide. This is a great way to start to make sure you're getting it as correct in the camera as possible. And so let's look at some raw files. Oops, I need to go back here. Okay. So to start off with, here's a bunch of raw files that have a bad white balance on them. Obviously, they're looking very blue. So I'm just going to grab one series of these and open those up into Camera Raw. And this is going to work whether I'm shooting raw in Lightroom or raw in Adobe Bridge. So to start off with, I'm just going to click on my gray value because I know that that's supposed to be neutral. I've got two different grays on here as part of what I was testing, and they both get me a good place to start. Excuse me. Okay. So looking at these, just by clicking on that gray, I've now white balanced. The next thing that I can do is, using my crop tool, crop in and get a white, black, and gray on that image. And what I'm looking for, again, is a gap left and a gap right by looking at the histogram up here on my screen. In this case, it was a little bit underexposed. I'm going to slide it a little bit to the right and even it up. So I'm looking for about the same distance here as I have here. And that has been applied to all three of those images. We'll clear the crop out. And let's just take one of these images and open it up into Photoshop. We're going to, again, go to our marquee tool and just marquee off the mask of the face and see that we're getting that same gap right, no gap left on this one because, again, we have quite a bit of contrast in it, but I'm seeing that my tones are in about the right places. Also, if I zoom in here and I bring my color sampler tool out, let's bring my info palette over. As I sample, I'm a little bit low. My red value should be in the 235 to 240 range. I'm at 231. My histogram's a little bit to the left, so those numbers are all balancing each other. If we close this and go back to the actual raw file, when we did our crop here, I probably could slide everything a little bit more to the right. And when we zoom in on the image, try to get that highlight value in that 235 range, which I can bring that up just a little bit more and get it where it needs to be. So we can use that zebra card as a tool to get our exposure correct and apply that as well as get our color correct. Okay? Now let's look at that same scenario and, let's look at if we had captured those JPEGs and had our white balance that far off. And let's just grab two images and open those up. Let's turn on our warning colors. And by coming in and click balancing on that, and using the crop on it, and try to bring that back in, we can see our histogram is starting to split, which is going to give us a clue that the color isn't going to be as good as it should be, and we can see that's kind of a nasty looking color. We could probably come in and punch it up a little bit, but it's never going to be as good as if we had captured it correctly. To compare this, let's open that image, jump back into Bridge, and go to the same raw file. And it's already had a correction made to it in Bridge, so I'm not going to recorrect it. and bring them side by side. And the image on the right was the raw file. The image on the left is corrected from that bad color JPEG. And we can see that there's some crossover issues in it. The hair's kind of gone to a green. The background is a magenta color. So we've got it's better than it was, but it's still not a great image. Okay, so I'm repeating myself over and over and over again, and it's because these things are what work, is get it right in the camera for color and for exposure. Now, I'm going to take you to one more technique to show you, and this is very reliant on the capture stage. So let's take you over and show you this product. The first two things I've showed you are things you can get at no charge. This is actually a physical product that you have to go out and purchase and use at the time of capture. And it's the X-Rite Photos Color Checker Passport. This is pretty new. They're about $90 to $100 range, and it's one of those tools that I've worked with. I'm not going to say extensively. I've worked with it enough that I see that it has a lot of merit to it when it's used properly. And let me show you how this works. So we'll get rid of this, jump back into Bridge one more time, and look at a series of images. I was at a photography workshop 2 weekends ago and had an opportunity to take a color passport with me and do some shooting. And the way you use this is whether you're shooting RAW or JPEG, and it's geared more for a RAW shooter, but it can work with JPEGs as well. You're just not going to be able to get as much oomph out of it. It's not going to do as dramatic a job for you. You first start by shooting, and actually you can see it's a little plastic notebook, and as you open it one page, you're going to see you have this white gray card, and you use that to do a custom white balance off of. Then when you open it up to the next side, you see that you have a Macbeth color checker and then some additional tools over here. And what you do is you start by doing a custom white balance in the camera off of that first image. Then you photograph this next file. So I'm going to open these two up into Camera Raw real quick, and just double click my white balance has been applied. I'm going to then take this second file. Oops, I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to take this second file and I'm going to save this out as a DNG, or a digital negative. And I'm just going to save that out on my desktop. And I'm waiting for that to come out here. Place that on my desktop and say select, and save out that digital negative. So it's saving that to my desktop, and I haven't really done anything yet but color correct this first file based on the custom white balance I did. Now that is done, I'm going to minimize Adobe Bridge and Photoshop, and I now have this DNG file that I've just created. I'm going to open up this Color Checker Passport software, which comes with when you buy the Color Checker, and this is the software tool that you really need. I'm going to take and just drop that DNG file that we created inside the Color Checker Passport, and it's analyzing the image and it's looking for the Macbeth portion of that color checker. The Macbeth portion is the right side of the chart that has all the different color samples on it. So it's taken a minute, it's thinking about all that. And what it's looking to do is it's found the color checker in the image, and it's now mapped each one of those tones, the black through white, as well as all the different colors in there. And now it wants to create a profile. So I'm going to create a profile, and this was captured with a Canon EOS 5D Mark II under this lighting condition, which was overcast. This is something that you need to work. If you're going to use this, you're going to need to create a set of profiles for different lighting conditions. You might have one for studio light. You may have one for overcast. You might want to have for heavy overcast and light overcast. So it's something that you can do as you shoot to capture these, or you may have some presets that you saved in the background. This saves into my camera profiles on a Mac, and it's going to save into a similar location on your PC. It's going to also load this profile up into Adobe Camera Raw or Adobe Lightroom automatically for me. So I'm going to save that profile out. While it's saving, I'm going to quit Adobe Bridge and Photoshop and then just relaunch them. And at that point, I'm going to close my color checker. Now when I come to a set of images, so these three images here were captured under a very similar lighting condition as where I photographed the color checker. So I'm going to grab it as well and open those up into Camera Raw. I'm using the same techniques as we've talked about already in I'm going to click balance on a neutral area in my image for my custom white balance. The change here is I'm going to come over to my camera calibration tab, and you see here our standard camera profile is Adobe Standard, but I now have one down here called Canon EOS 5D Mark II Cloudy 2. This is the profile we just created. And if we change to that, notice the blues in this image. I'm just going to zoom up to the color checker. I'm going to go back to Adobe Standard and then to the Mark II. And you see some pretty big differences in all of the colors. They end up having just a little bit more vibrance, a little bit more pop to them based on which profile I choose. Okay? Great. That's applied those to those images. Is this something that we really see in our final print? It is, and let me show you. I'm going to close out of this, and let's look at three different files. And it's going to take me a second to get these opened up. Let's start by looking at this file here. Go into, there was another one called Camera Portrait. And our last one is the custom profile. When we look at these three on the screen, and this is where we have to evaluate a little bit subjectively. I've actually physically printed these, so I'm going to tell you what I saw in the prints and where I saw it on the images. The first off, on these three, you're going to see that there really isn't, in the skin tones, we'll zoom up and, oops, I didn't want that to come up here. Window, arrange. We can see that they look very similar. There's a little bit difference in the pinks here on her lips. The skin tones do change a little bit, but they're pretty subtle. Lisa asked, did I set overcast? I did my custom white balance based on the color checker, so I didn't set my white balance to overcast, but I chose the profile to overcast because that's the one that was created when I shot the image. I hope that answers your question. If not, type back at me. We can see here that the Camera Portrait and the Adobe Standard's on the left, Camera Portrait's on the right, have a different tone in her guitar strap than the custom profile does. This has a little bit more vibrance in the pinks. The other thing that we can see is there's a little bit of shift in the color of her hair. The whites and the grays in her hat are all exactly the same. But we start to see more of a shift, and I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. Back in some of the tones in the bricks as they're shifting around. The camera profile brought out a little bit more green tone in there, and you can actually see that in the print. Let's look at one more image here, or one more set. custom profile is the one on the right. Camera portrait is on the, or I'm sorry, on the left is the custom portrait, the custom profile. Adobe Standard in the middle, custom portrait in the right. And what you really see on this one is look at the skin tone here in the shadow area under her neck and how that is handled. We see that the camera portrait gets very, I'm going to use the term blotchy. It's also very red. Where we look at the custom profile, we have a much smoother transition in her skin tone there under her neck. So just having a good custom white balance and a good exposure, we can still get one level better by learning how to use a tool like this color checker. It's going to help us dial in a little bit more accurately and adjust our images a little bit better. Okay? Well, I'm going to stop at this point. I'm going to close everything out on my screen and head back to the main screen for just a minute and pause right now and see if anybody has any questions. That does bring us to the official end of today's class on getting good color, a few tips. And I'm going to stop the recording